Well, David, it's so great to have you joining me on the Nothing is Wasted podcast. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it is an honor to spend time with you. Thanks for having me.
Man, I'm so excited for our community to hear from you. And, you know, a couple of days ago when I was digging into some of your material, some of the things that you do, one, our content producer was just ecstatic about having you on. She was just thrilled. And so I'm like, well, what's the big deal? Let me look at this. And then I started reading it and I started realizing this is probably going to be more of a counseling session for me than for anybody else. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you're listening to this, you're just privy to some really good insight that I'm going to glean personally. And I know you're going to glean.
We can go
as well.
any direction we need to.
David, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, where you're from, and then we'll just kind of dive into some of the questions I'd love to ask you.
Love to. So I am first and foremost a proud son, husband and father of 3 kids, and also am a therapist. I've been practicing for the past 25 years at this amazing place here in Nashville, Tennessee called Daystar Counseling. And we're a bit unique in that we just serve the pediatric population. Our whole focus is kids, adolescents, and families. So we're actually in a house rather than an office building. Which is a very intentional decision, because if any parent listening has ever taken a kid you love to counseling, if you've ever gone yourself, you know it can be an overwhelming experience that first time. Yeah. And so we do as much as we can to try to make it disarming and help kids feel safe when they walk through the front doors of our house. We also have 5 therapy dogs on staff, which are hands down kids' favorite therapists. We're all very aware we're low in the pecking order in terms of being kids' favorites, and we're fine with that. So that gives you, exactly, you can't compete with the dogs.
That's right.
And that gives you a snapshot, just a brief snapshot of how we do the work we do really differently. And I work with this incredible team of folks that I learn so much from on a daily basis, and have for decades now sat with some amazing families who are walking out some unbelievably hard circumstances that I've learned so much from. And so out of that learning, getting to write some books and travel around the country and teach to parents what I'm learning, like the best stuff I'm learning from sitting front row with kids and families daily. And so I'm incredibly grateful for that privilege and the privilege of getting to talk with amazing folks like you, where we can just come together in conversation and talk about what it looks like to serve and support the kids we love. Because in 25 years of doing this work, Davey, I mean, I don't think it's ever been a harder time to be a kid. It's never been a harder time to be a teenager. It's certainly never been a harder time to be a parent. And so anything I can do to champion and encourage parents, I want to be about. So thank you for inviting me to talk about these important things today.
Wow. Well, we're honored. You know, a lot of our community, they've walked through a lot of tragedy and trauma themselves. And many of them are trying to figure out how to put the pieces back together in their own life, figure out how to sort through grief, loss, childhood trauma, things they're realizing that they've suppressed for years and years and years themselves. And they're kind of coming to the realization that their kids are living in the fallout of that. And some of them, their kids have been directly impacted by it. Right. And so they're trying to figure out how do I process my own pain while helping my child or my children process theirs as well. It doesn't seem like I even have the emotional capacity to be able to do so. What would you say in terms of where do we start with that? You know, how do I begin to just even create a space to be able to, you know, foster that in any way?
Yeah. You know, I would first say this. Research has long told us, and this is certainly aligns with my experience, that kids learn more from observation than information. They learn way more from watching us than anything else. And so I have long believed, I will always believe, that one of the greatest gifts that we can give the kids we love is doing our own work as parents, so that when they're watching us, when they're sitting front row to the folks they trust the most in this world, they're seeing parents who are working to be the healthiest version of themselves they can, emotionally, relationally, spiritually, on every level. And, you know, I would challenge any parent listening to even think about your own story, because I think if we've not thought enough about our own story, it's really difficult to walk with kids in their story, because we will end up inevitably, you know, Richard Rohr's famous saying of whatever we don't transform, we'll transfer. And so that is the beginning point, I believe, for every one of us, myself included, as parents. And out of that place, kids get to watch and observe and learn what it means to be a human being in this world, what it means to be a person who struggles emotionally, what it means to be a person who intersects with loss, which will be a part of every one of our stories. None of us are exempt from that. And so to the degree that we can do those things ourselves, kids get an opportunity to see what that looks like. And I wrote a new book recently called Raising Emotionally Strong Boys. And in the introduction of that book, I talk about how we can only take the kids we love as far as we've gone ourselves. Like to the degree that we know our own stories, then we can walk with them in theirs. And then I'm not assigning them part of my story. You know, I can be present with them differently. And certainly when I intersect with tragedy, I hopefully have tools in place for myself that allow me to be present with my kids, as opposed to I'm so overwhelmed by my own emotion and I don't know what to do with it. But I simply would say, lastly, in my experience, a lot of parents today grew up in homes, and this is not a criticism of our parents. It's just a reality of the world they grew up in, where, you know, we just didn't talk about emotions a lot. Yeah. And, you know, there was a lot of keeping secrets, and there was a lot of believing. I think we've long believed that if we don't talk to kids about hard things, then they're not experiencing them in any way. And the reality being, if we don't talk to kids about hard things, they are experiencing them, and then they're alone with them, as opposed to figuring out what does it look like to have age-appropriate conversations with kids, to acknowledge what's there, what's happening within our families, what's happening within the world, and in age-appropriate ways so that kids feel prepared. I'd even give one practical example in saying, I think many of us grew up believing that it would be a very bad idea if we were in marital counseling ourselves to talk with kids about that, because it would make them feel like, oh, there's something wrong with my parents' marriage. We believe the opposite. Like if you're in marital counseling, that's a great and healthy and helpful thing for kids to know. Right. Like mom and I, dad and I meet with someone who helps us be the best husband and wife we can be, who helps us figure things out when we get stuck. And I can't tell you the safety I have experienced working with kids that offers them. I've even had kids say to me, hey, will you tell my mom and dad to meet with their person? And it's this sense of, I'm so glad there's a third party involved who can help my mom and dad when I notice they're having a hard time. So I'd encourage parents to go the opposite direction. You know, be very vocal about that. Talk about when you've had conversations with friends, with pastors, with trusted, you know, mentors in your own life in ways that I think, model for kids. This is what it looks like to be a grown up in this world, to live in a healthy way, and what it looks like to ask for help. Yeah. Because we all need it.
Wow. Wow, that's so good. You know, I think one of the things that inhibits us a lot of times as parents in recognizing maybe what our kids are going through is just a general sense of awareness or attunement to them, you know, whether it's busyness or whether it's like, again, just being so bogged down with trying to do our own self-work that it's really difficult to, you know, be intentional about leaning into those situations with our kids. And so what will often happen, at least what I've discovered happens with me, because my MO tends to be busyness. And then all of a sudden my kids ask a question that seems a little off, right? And it's like, wait a minute, where did that come from? And that sometimes that question might even trigger me. You know, this morning, I'll give this to you anecdotally. Okay, this morning I'm driving the kids to school. And Weston, my son, he's 8 years old now. He was 15 months old when my wife was killed, and she was you know, shot and killed. He asked a random question about a bullet and a gun. He said, how does a bullet work? Can you see a bullet when it comes out of a gun? And man, David, that question stopped me in my tracks. Like if I hadn't been driving the car, I would have just been, and I kind of panicked. I'm freaked out. I'm like, how do I answer this question? You know, because I kind of feel like I know what's underneath this question, but I also want to invite it in a way that's age appropriate, you know? So I don't know if you have any kind of, maybe this is just advice for me, but as those things begin to kind of crop up, because it seems like they will as they get older, you know, as they kind of move into different seasons of life, can you give us a little bit of like framework for how do we help kids process through difficult things that they've experienced or that they're wrestling through?
Yeah. First thing I would say in terms of a framework is let's always follow kids' lead. Because I believe, we believe as a practice that kids have an internal barometer that cues them to what they can handle. So they won't ask questions that are connected to answers they can't work with has been our consistent experience. So when they're leading with a question, it can give parents a sense of safety of, okay, I can step into this conversation again in an age-appropriate way. That's going to look different with an 8-year-old and an 18-year-old, knowing that they're needing something. And kids are going to need different things in different stages of development, as we all know. But even as they navigate loss, they're going to need more information as they go forward in their own journeys and can work with more. The mistake I think we make as parents is that we'll follow their lead, answer a question, and then sometimes give them more information than they're asking for. And it fascinates me all the way kids will cue us to that. You know, I have heard parents say, you know, their kids are like, holding their ears and say, can we be done talking now? Or my ears are hurting, you know, all the ways that I think kids cue us to. I was asking for just this much information, and now you're giving me this much information, and that's more than I can work with. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in following their lead. I really do. And the other thing I'd say to that is we want to answer in concrete ways. So for every parent listening, if your kids are 12 and under, in terms of their cognitive development, they're in what we call concrete thinking. So research would tell us we don't begin developing abstract thinking where we can see the grays of the world until adolescence. Girls develop it earlier, boys a little bit later. So even as adolescents are beginning to develop abstract thinking, they still have one foot firmly planted in concrete thinking. So we want to use a lot of concrete language. So a practical example would be this: when we meet with families who are divorcing, it's common that parents who are divorcing might say things like, we grew apart. Well, that's abstract language. That's not helpful to kids. In fact, it can trigger some anxiety where kids think, wait, if you grew apart, could we grow apart too?
Wow. Yeah.
You know, as opposed to using more concrete language like, you know what, our marriage is broken. And kids don't understand that concept. Like sometimes I knock a lamp over and it breaks and it can't be repaired. Sometimes I knock a lamp over and it doesn't break and it's okay. Sometimes the lamp can be fixed with help. Sometimes it can. So think about all the conversations we have with kids where we could use as much concrete language. You know, so for example, when we talk with kids about death, we can tend to want to stay away from some of the hard realities. And in doing so, again, good intentions, we can make it more confusing. So, for example, we say things like, he then just went to sleep, as opposed to saying, using concrete language like, his heart stopped beating. And when his heart stopped beating, he stopped breathing. And then when he stopped breathing, what that meant when he opened his eyes next, for those of us who are followers of Christ, we can say, he opened his eyes and the next person he saw was Jesus. So you see these concrete things I'm describing, and the heart stopped beating, the eyes opening. And so I just would encourage any parent listening, think about age-appropriate ways that we can use a lot of concrete language and then follow their lead. That would be kind of a beginning point of a framework I would want to encourage parents with.
Wow. That is, I mean, that is amazing. It seems so simple, right? But it's paradigm shifting for many of us, right? Because pain and talking about those things are already uncomfortable for us. And then when we're wading through the waters of trying to figure out how to, you know, distill that to our kids, that can be extremely uncomfortable. And so just remembering to have concrete language, especially under the age of 12, and not overshare, I mean, that's powerful. I think that is extremely helpful, David. You know, let's talk about that a little bit in the development stages, you know, because sometimes I've found with our kids that, you know, particularly my 8-year-old son, he seems to have, you know, there's some areas of development that he's slower in. And I'm wondering, you know, I've heard that that's pretty common when it comes to experiencing trauma. Yes. From what I understand about his trauma, his would not necessarily be the event of, even though he was in his crib the whole time, he, from what we understand, he was, you know, untouched, or he didn't see anything, you know, but it was the aftermath, right? It was the losing his primary caregiver, all of the crazy transition, the disruption of his schedule and stuff, and the attachment from his mom years following that has created that trauma. Okay. So I guess my question is what are some developmental things that maybe could clue us in before our kids can speak up and say, hey, or ask a question, you know, like what are some things that maybe early on can help us to go, okay, we might be seeing some things that we need to just pay attention to here?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say first off, and this really is true, I think, for kids from toddlers to teenagers, that all behavior is communication. All behavior is communication. Kids are always telling us something, even when they can't use their words. And so, first question I would want to encourage parents to be asking, in even the hardest moments where we're seeing a lot of, what looks like just noncompliance or disobedience, being able to ask within our response, like, I wonder what else is going on. I think about even, the book years ago a couple of years ago that Oprah released, where she wonderfully helped culturally us ask a different question. Like, if we saw people struggling, instead of asking the question, I think we instinctively ask of what's wrong with you? What if we were to ask what happened to you? And I love that shifting of mindset that I think we could bring into the context of parenting, of when we see kids struggling, as opposed to just thinking, I want to address that behavior, wonder what's happening underneath that behavior. Wonder what else I need to know that they're cueing me to. And so, for example, we know with young children navigating loss, we are very likely to see at least some evidence of regression. So, for example, kids who were successfully sleeping on their own through the night are all of a sudden waking up or throwing a lot of fits at bedtime because they're scared to be alone in their room. Of course they are, particularly if you've lost someone in an unexpected and tragic way, that you would have more fears at nighttime when the lights go out and you're alone in your room. Or kids who've successfully potty trained who start to regress and are having accents at that point because they're carrying more emotion, so they're not paying as much attention to reading the signs and signals their body's giving them when I need to hit pause and go relieve myself. All these different ways that we could see regression. Kids who've been more successful in relational experiences all of a sudden are just losing it when someone takes a toy from them. So again, rather than just addressing the behavior, how could I ask the question of what's underneath the behavior? What else might be in play that I need to pay attention to, that I think allows us to approach kids differently? I would even say that to be true outside of the experience of loss and trauma for kids and adolescents. Like every developmental theorist would say, not most, that 13 to 15 is what we describe as the worst episode of a person's life. Like there's never another stretch of development where any of us felt more insecure, more unsure of ourselves, more uncomfortable in our own skin. So we're going to be incapable of being the best version of ourselves. So asking in different moments when kids are disrespectful, again, not saying we're going to let them off the hook with disrespect. I'm not endorsing that at all. I want us to address it, but also wonder what else is going on. I wonder how much time you spend throughout the day worrying about how people see you, how you look, how you sound, how you're performing athletically, all these things that would make you more irritable, grumpy, disrespectful, isolating, all the things. So if we were to think that to be true within the normal context of development and a complicated stage of development, how much more should we be thinking about that when our kids are navigating trauma, carrying more than they've ever carried?
The Nothing is Wasted content library of resources and podcast episodes are made possible by our growing community of members. If you would like to be a part of having a global impact and help people partner with God to take back their stories, consider joining Community Plus for just $20 a month. Your membership comes with access to a course called Position for Redemption, masterclasses taught by our certified coaches, bonus podcast episodes, and Q&As with myself and some of our other special guests. You can get more information and sign up at nothingiswasted.com/community. I look forward to connecting with you further within our Community Plus platform.
Wow. Whew. That's so good. Have you noticed, is there a difference between how genders, different, male, female, how they're going to respond in these situations, or their progression of development or the progression of healing, or any differences there?
Some significant differences. And, think back to those early pediatric visits when pediatricians at 12, 18, 24 months are going to be asking us as parents, questions like, how many words is he saying? How many words is she saying? What the research would tell us is that girls are often saying 2 to 3 times the number of words that boys are in those early visits. Now, there are certainly exceptions to that rule. Some boys who are talking more, some girls who are talking less, but generally speaking, if her general vocabulary is larger, which it often is, understandably her emotional vocabulary would be larger. So in my new book, I talk a lot about we're going to have to labor longer and harder with boys to develop an expansive emotional vocabulary. So that will simply mean, to your great question, he will inevitably likely have a harder time talking about his experience, talking about his feelings, talking about his worries. And so generally speaking, we're going to see girls articulating a bit more of their experience and asking for help. It fascinates me how early I think boys begin moving toward suppression and self-reliance. And then culturally, I think we encourage it with men. Like we celebrate men's independence, not needing anybody, you know, got the world by the tail. And so we're going to have to do a lot to move against those cultural messages that teach boys it is a good and healthy way to live in this world when I acknowledge how I feel and I ask for help, because we all do. So because those things are in play, I think it makes the experience look way different. And generally speaking, you know, for example, when we look at the research around anxiety, we talk a lot about two presentations when kids are feeling anxious. There is what we call a classic imploder, which I think tends to be more girls more often. There's certainly some firstborn boys that fit this, but it's kids who turn the anxiety inward and they become more perfectionistic and pleasing and performing externally. Then there are what we call classic exploders, and they turn it outward. So those are kids who are acting out in different places. And I'd argue, generally speaking, more girls are going to be imploders, more boys are going to be exploders. Again, exceptions to every rule. But it's part of why, though girls are twice as likely to struggle with anxiety, more boys get taken in for help. Because I think anxious girls in classrooms, for example, they're a teacher's dream.
They're like that.
Absolutely. They're going above and beyond what's required of them. Where anxious boys look restless, fidgety, impulsive, sometimes angry and volatile. So the presentation is so different that it's honestly easy to miss in both places. We can miss perfectionistic girls and actually even praise them for turning all that anxiety inward. Like, I love when you're going above and beyond. Good for you for making straight A's, you know, missing the fact that she's trying to manage some internal by performing externally. And we can miss it with boys because we're just addressing the behaviors happening in those spaces, as opposed to, again, looking beneath the behaviors to figure out what else could be in play. So anxiety is but one of many things we could talk about that often looks so different, unique to gender, that would make it easy to miss what's really there, which takes us right back to, let's change the question. Instead of what's wrong with you, what happened to you, what else is going on? All behaviors communication.
Wow. You've brought up a really great point in terms of trying to weigh the difference between behavioral issues and things that are going on internally, and how those, you know, internal anxieties are manifesting themselves often in behavior. And I love the question, right? What else is going on? What else, I wonder, is going on? One of the biggest things that, you know, my wife and I now, we wrestle with, we find ourselves asking the question, is this a normal childhood behavior or is this trauma related? And it honestly, David, it's kind of frustrating because I'm like, man, there are some parents who their kids have not experienced the level of trauma that our kids have experienced, and they can default to, this is behavior that needs to be disciplined, right? For us, we're like, I don't know. And it causes us to second guess ourselves in virtually everything they do. Is there any help that you could, I mean, there's so many people who are listening to this, they've experienced the same thing and they come down heavy handed, maybe in a situation where they should have been a little bit more empathetic and entered into, you know, how do we navigate that? How do we walk that razor thin line, it feels like?
You know, I would say this first. I actually sat with a parent yesterday. We were talking around that very thing. And the mom wisely, wonderfully said to me, you know, I'm worried that I'm overreading at times. I'm worried I'm paying too much attention to trauma and the fact that a lot of this just could be normal. And so I would say one place of support I'd offer in response to your question would be, if you're unsure about that, I think it is a gift to every kid if we just put another set of eyes on the equation that I think allows us to get clarity on what's going on with kids, but also peace of mind for us as parents. And whether that's just consulting with your pediatrician, just saying, hey, I want to ask a few questions unique to this observation, or in our practice, we do a lot of what we call parent consultations, and we do those with parents all over the country by Zoom or by phone. And it's not where parents are bringing kids in, but parents are coming in just themselves, coming to the table to ask questions like, here's what we're seeing. What are your thoughts on that? And putting another set of eyes on that, I think, can be so useful, again, for clarity for kids, peace of mind for parents. So I would say that's one thing to tuck away. Secondly, I would say back to what I shared about regression. Every kid is going to regress at some different points. That's normal to development. It's a little bit like 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. As long as when we calculate all the steps, there are more steps forward and fewer steps back, that's what we always want to see. But none of us are on a perfect trajectory of only steps forward. It's like going to work every day and giving 100%, meeting all my sales goals. We're all going to have off days. And so we're not concerned about regression unless it becomes consistent, like there's more backwards movement than forwards movement. If we were to go back to, okay, they are sleeping in their bed more nights than they're not. They are successfully going to the restroom more times than they're having accents. That's not concerning. But if it's like they're having more accents than they're having successes, that's when we're like, okay, that's more backwards movement. Let's circle around that. Let's maybe put some seasoned eyes on that. So I would say that equation can be of great importance. In fact, 2 concrete benchmarks that I think parents could use, whether it's regression in those behaviors, or let's say it's just regression in acting out. As you're layering in support, ask about intensity and frequency. So is the behavior happening more or less? And when it happens, this is the intensity part, on a 1 to 10 scale, is it always in the 8 to 10 space? Or does it seem to sometimes just be, actually, we don't ever get above 5 sometimes. So those are 2 good benchmarks I think parents could use as a measuring stick as you're observing behaviors or observing regression that allows you to track on paper, like literally put some notes down that allow you to look at the bigger picture. Because when we're in the moment, it can sometimes feel like it's happening every day, all the time, all day long. And it may not be. And it's just we're exhausted and we're carrying a lot. But I would lastly just say to your great question, I think an equation I talk a lot with parents about, and let's put it in the context of anxiety, for example, that we just talked about. We always want to try to be landing in 2 places, and the 2 places would be support and challenge. And we want to be offering equal parts of both. So if we're overreading the trauma and only giving kids support but never challenging them, we may be inviting kids to go backwards. If I'm not creating challenge to help them eventually learn to sleep in their own bed, but offering support when I lay down with them at night for a few minutes to pray with them and practice some things that might help them fall asleep a little more successfully. Do you see where I'm hitting both parts in that, as opposed to just climb in my bed every night? Well, that's all support with no challenge. And that's not helpful because, we want kids to feel like they could go to sleepaway camp or spend the night, or eventually we want them to go to college and there are no mother-son dormitories anywhere. So they got to live on their own. And so thinking about that long game, we want to always be trying to target support and challenge. And what the research would tell us with anxious kids, for example, is the 2 biggest parenting mistakes that we can make are escape and avoidance. I see my kids struggling and I want to extract them from the struggle immediately. And what all the anxiety research would tells us time and time again is that in order to do the hard thing, to face the hard thing, I've got to do the hard thing. And the definition that we work with in our practice is that anxiety is an overestimation of the problem and an underestimation of myself. So if I, as a parent, am always extracting kids, I'm confirming that definition. I'm saying, yes, the problem, the situation is way too big and you're way too small. So I'm going to pull you out of that. And we want to be sending the opposite memo to kids of, no, the problem's not too big and you're not too small.
Wow.
And I'm here with you and God is with you too. So that's where we really want to think about, are we moving towards support and challenge, or are we moving toward escape and avoidance? Because we're not only not helping kids if it's only escape and avoidance, we're actually harming them. We're making the situation worse. We're confirming that definition.
Wow. David, can you say that definition of anxiety again? That was succinct but powerful.
And I want to, as I do, give all the credit we use in our practice, because my dear friend and colleague, Sissy Goff, wrote what I think is one of the best books out there on girls and anxiety because the stats are so high for girls. She wrote an amazing book called Raising Worry-Free Girls. And that's the definition she put together that we've long used in our practice. It is an overestimation of the problem or situation and an underestimation of themselves.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And think about it.
Man.
You know, for example, we're here we are recording right now, you and I on the front side of the school year, and there are thousands of kids out there who are having anxiety about going to school, and
Right.
some kids who are struggling to get out of the car every morning. Not a few tears, sobbing uncontrollably. Some are gripping the car door as parents try to pry them out. You know, a lot of fear and worry about going into that context. And, you know, if a parent were to make the decision, and I want to be very clear as I say this, to say, okay, fine, we're just going to pull out of school. We're just going to homeschool, which, hear me say very clearly, homeschooling is a great option if chosen for the right reasons.
Yeah.
It's not a good option if it's just you're afraid to go to school, so I'm going to pull you out altogether, because you see where that would be confirming that definition. School's way too scary. You're not capable.
Wow.
As opposed to you're capable. It's not too scary. And so think on that in all the different contexts where you're seeing kids face worry, come up against fear, experiencing anxiety. That's something that I hope could be helpful as parents are navigating that space.
Powerful, man. Yeah. That's so helpful. So helpful. David, you already mentioned that, you know, at some point it's good to get seasoned eyes on the problem, especially if you're beginning to see whether it's like a stagnation or plateau, or even even further regression, right? We're not taking steps forward. So obviously one of those eyes would be a great counselor. A lot of people are asking the question for their kids, when is it time to put my kid in counseling? What kind of counseling should we look for? How do we know when we have found the right counselor for our kids? You know, there are lots of questions surrounding that. What would you say? How would you help people understand, okay, this is the kind of counselor that you should be looking for your kids. This, when it's appropriate to look for counseling for your kids. This is, you know, how to know you found the right one. I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do. And I would say if you are straddling that decision of do I take kids or do I not, I think it's always a great, safe place to land to start with a consultation, because it may be, and I often do, for example, when I do consultations with parents, I will say, you know what, when they ask, should I bring him in based on everything we've just shared with you? Should I bring her in? I sometimes will say, no, you shouldn't, because I want you to try these 4 things first, or I want you to read this book and do these things, and then let's see what we see and reevaluate. And sometimes I can work myself out of a job. You know, one of the things I mentioned, my dear friend and colleague, Sissy Goff, she wrote a great workbook for elementary age girls with anxiety called Braver, Stronger, Smarter. And when she asked me to review it, I said to her, Sissy, you are giving away 3 free months of counseling. Like, this is incredible. Like, I love this. And both of us are hopeful we'll work ourselves out of a job and with certain kids that the need may not be there if parents take these steps. I wrote a workbook for elementary age boys called Strong and Smart, and it's a boy's guide to building emotional tools. And so my great hope is that might be enough for a percentage of kids. Now, if it's not, that's okay. And I'm grateful we have great resources. And that speaks to the other part of your great question, which is I would consider contacting your pediatrician and say, who are the folks you most trust? Because every pediatrician, particularly in this day and age, particularly since the pandemic, are going to have a list of trusted resources in your community, folks they've screened and know do really good focus work with the pediatric population. And then I'd also ask, I think children's ministers often have a great resource in place, because a lot of parents are starting there. And then maybe look at who falls on both lists. And you certainly want to be working with someone who does have some experience working with kids, because I do think it's a different game. Now, they may also work with adults, and that's great, but I'm concerned about someone who only works with adults and it's like, well, I don't really see kids, but we could give it a shot. You just, it's really a different skill set. No different than I say to my friends who do marital work, like, that is not my game. I'm sending my sure way. I'm not going to pretend like I know how to do marital work. That wasn't my training. And so we want to really think on specialty. And we also want to think about collaboration. So, for example, we meet in our practice every 3rd appointment to come together with parents and share observations. What are you seeing? Let me share what I'm seeing. Let's work together. No difference than parents conference with teachers at different intervals along the way. We want the adults who are caring for kids in the educational space, in the therapeutic space, in the pediatric space, to be coming together in conversation and make sure we're sharing notes. We're, talking, not literally sharing notes in my profession, but, having conversation around what it looks like to collectively come together and collaborate on behalf of these kids. And so I do think that's important, because we've had some parents come to us who are like, I took my kids to a counselor, but they only met with me every 12 sessions for about 5 minutes. And I just don't feel like I got a lot of input. And I'm always puzzled by that. I don't want to be judging of that, but I'm puzzled by that, because I think I'm not sure how you'd offer the best support unless you have the full picture. Because, we're talking about anxious kids. One of the things we know that anxious kids can sometimes do, particularly those performing kids, is they want to so be doing the right thing. They come into counseling and they'll underreport their struggle sometimes, or they'll overreport their success. Like they'll say things like, I got a little bit upset on Tuesday night, but it didn't last for very long. And parents come in and are like, it wasn't a little bit upset. It was a lot upset, and it lasted a very long time. And we need that full picture to offer the full support. Or they'll say, I practice every strategy we've been working on. And then parents will say, they did for about 60 seconds and then threw in the towel and just melted down, kind of defaulted to old patterns. And so we need to know that too. All of that is part of that collaborative work that gives us full support. So I would say, lastly, to your question, I think that's key, of someone who is going to work collaboratively with parents to make sure communication is running both directions, so we can offer that best full support.
Well, that's great. That's great. All right. Last question I want to, and I know this could open up a can of worms. So I guess I'm asking for a little bit more of a flyover, but we're all beginning to recognize, and even the media itself is beginning to report the effects that technology is having, especially social media, having on our kids. I guess my question we could do an entire, maybe we can convince David to come back and we can talk some more about this another time. But my question would be, what should we be aware of when it comes to that? As parents, how should we lean into this space? Technology seems to be inevitable on certain fronts, right? We've got to use it. Yes. This is great. It avails us this awesome opportunity. But what should we be aware of when it comes to our kids and their mental health?
Yeah. I don't think we can pay too much attention in that space. And I love even the way you asked that question, because I do think it feels so overwhelming to us as parents. And I get it. I get it. I'm a parent myself, and I understand how overwhelming it is to manage that animal of technology, to use it for its benefits, to keep my kids safe from the harmful parts of it. So I understand where parents can land in a place of just saying, we're never having it. There'll be no screens in our house. And, at the end of the day, I liken technology to driving a lot. And so I think if we're to say that, it's like, you're never getting in a car. The roads aren't safe. Well, we want kids to learn to drive. They need that skill set in place. So it's a part of our kids' life. How can we teach them to use it responsibly? Which is, stay with that analogy about driving. In our country, you aren't eligible to get a permit until a certain age. So, there's a reason most social media platforms have a recommended age of 13 and 14. And that's just the recommendation of starting. You may choose to wait later. But I'm shocked by how many parents are giving access at 8 or 9. Like we didn't just grab those numbers out of the air. Like, it's too much for young minds. So pay attention to the age recommendations. And then in that driving analogy, in the 15th year of life, we don't just toss keys at kids and say, let me know how it works out. We spend a whole year in the car with them, giving them feedback. You can't drive without an adult present in your 15th year of life with a permit. And then your 16th year, we don't just toss keys at you. We say, okay, I'm going to put Life 360 on your phone so I can make sure you're where you're supposed to be, that you arrive safely, or I'm going to have you text me when you get from point A to point B. All these different ways that we are baby stepping our way toward the big scary thing. And if we could consider treating technology that same way, we're going to give a lot of input, a lot of oversight. When you're on these platforms, I'm going to have your password, all those things that are part of practicing responsibly the same way we practice driving. And then think on, if we were to keep that analogy running forward, when kids blow it, as they often will do with driving and technology, it's like, I'm going to take your keys. You don't have access to it for a while. And then I'm going to give it back. I'm not taking it forever. I'm going to take it temporarily, and then you're going to have the opportunity to prove you're responsible again. So let's use that same framework as we think about moving into technology, preparing kids
Yeah.
Not keeping them from it, but preparing them while they're on our watch, where we can teach them to use both responsibly.
Wow. Wow. David, this entire conversation has been unbelievably helpful. I mean, to me personally, I know to our entire community, we're so grateful for your voice in this space and what you're doing. And, you've got a new book that is available for pre-order right now, right? Strong and Smart, A Boy's Guide to Building Healthy Emotions. Amazing. And you've got several other books that you've written as well. And
Thank you.
We're excited about. We'll put all of that information, links where people can grab those resources on the show notes here. And then is there a place that you would want people to, if they want to follow you, if they want to find out more about what you're doing or the practice with Daystar Counseling, where can they go?
You could go to raisingboysandgirls.com is our hub, and you could find everything there. Our books, our podcast, there's a link to Daystar. If you wanted to do one of the consultations we talked about, it'll walk you through how to do that. So really everything is housed in that space would be the easiest way to find my work. And Davey, I want to say to you before we end, just how grateful I am you'd invite me into this conversation, how thankful I am for the life-giving work you're doing in this world. I'm so grateful. I am so grateful you would choose to steward your story in the way you have and offer this kind of space for people to have these kind of meaningful conversations. So it was my genuine honor. Please hear me say that. Thanks for having me.
Man, thank you. This has just been so wonderful having you. We're going to have you back on at some point, David. We have to.
I love it.
I've got a lot more to learn from you. Thanks, man, for joining us.
Hey, friend, if you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe so that you can stay in the loop every time Nothing is Wasted releases a piece of content here on this YouTube channel.